I spent decades raising my children with hands that ached and a heart that refused to stop stretching. I scrubbed floors until my knees cracked, cooked meals I barely had the money for, and stayed awake night after night, listening to their cries, their dreams, their fears. I did it all without complaint. I thought that love, once given so freely, would return when I needed it most. But the truth was far harsher than I ever imagined. The day I grew old, the day I needed a hand to hold or a voice to reassure me, I realized I had been left alone, abandoned in a life I had spent entirely for others. It began with small things, almost imperceptible at first. Birthday cards arrived late, phone calls became shorter, the excuses piled up. "I'm busy, Mom," they said, as if the years of my own sacrifices could be erased by a few moments of inconvenience. I told myself it was nothing. Perhaps it was just the rhythm of life, the natural drift between parent and child. But when the calls stopped entirely, when the doors that had once swung open to my presence remained shut, I knew it was deliberate. I had become invisible, a relic of my own family's past, a burden too heavy to carry. I remember the first day it truly hit me. I had stood in the kitchen listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, and realized that no one would notice if I fell. My hands, once so steady, trembled slightly as I reached for a glass. I thought about my life, about the sacrifices that had defined me, and I felt the sharp pang of betrayal. I had given everything, yet in the one chapter where I needed someone, no one came. It wasn't just the physical absence, it was the assumptions, the whispers, the judgments. "She's old," they said. "She can't handle it alone." They assumed incompetence. They assumed weakness. They assumed I would fade quietly, that I would bow to their authority without question. And I will admit for a moment the world seemed to confirm their assumptions. I tripped over a rug. I forgot to pay a bill. I missed a doctor's appointment. Each small mistake felt monumental, as though the entire universe had conspired to prove me irrelevant. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't finished, not by a long shot. And so I began to plan. Not out of malice, but out of survival. I had been raised to fight, to endure, to protect myself when no one else would. I started documenting everything: dates, phone calls, letters, financial records, and conversations. I traced each incident of neglect, each moment where someone had assumed they could make decisions for me without my consent. I wrote it all down like a ledger of resilience, a record for the day when my voice could no longer be ignored. Contrast became my greatest tool. I had been gentle, giving, patient, forgiving, and now I would wield my quiet strength against those who had underestimated me. It wasn't about revenge in the sense of spite, it was about reclamation. My house, my finances, my dignity, my narrative, these were mine, and I would not let them be taken. I studied the laws, sought out advice, reached for help from those who understood elder rights. Every call to a lawyer, every appointment, every page of research became a brick in the foundation of my comeback. The day they came to tell me it was, for my own good, was the day everything changed. My eldest son, the boy I had carried through sleepless nights, the one I had sacrificed for endlessly, smiled politely as if rehearsed lines were more important than my feelings. His wife, equally polished, nodded in agreement. They told me I needed assistance, that it was time to consider a care facility. I had heard the words before, of course, in the polite, loving tones of friends who wanted to help. But this, the cold clinical delivery, the absence of consent, the hidden planning behind my back, felt like a dagger. I realized fully the extent of their assumption. They thought I would let them erase me. I didn't. When they walked me through the front doors of a facility, beige walls and plastic flowers greeting me like a trap, I felt a fury rise in my chest. But I didn't show it. They expected tears. They expected confusion. They expected me to shrink. Instead, I took a deep breath, surveyed my surroundings, and began cataloguing everything. Where the fire exits were, which nurse took which shift, the schedules, the routines, the papers I was handed with my name printed on signatures I had not signed. I recorded it all. Each small detail was a piece of armor, a tool for the day I would reclaim my life. It was there, in that room devoid of personal touches, that I realized the true measure of abandonment. The absence of family was compounded by the erasure of identity. No photographs, no familiar scents, no books, no calendar, just a bed and a dresser that had been chosen without me. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands folded, trying not to shake, but the tremor couldn't be denied. And yet, as the hours passed, as I observed, as I documented, I felt a strange clarity. The very things they thought would break me became the blueprint for my comeback. By the third day, I had a plan. I made a list of contacts, friends, attorneys, anyone who would help me assert my rights. I noted every irregularity, every act of overreach. I made copies of bills, documents, anything that might prove my competence and my ownership over my own life. And I waited. I didn't act rashly. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I knew the value of patience. They had assumed my compliance. They had assumed my silence. That was their first mistake. I called my lawyer, leaving a concise but deliberate message detailing the situation. I emphasized clarity, competence, and urgency. When she returned my call, Monica Reeves, she listened, truly listened, and I felt a glimmer of hope. We spoke through the details, through the mistakes my children had made, the documents they had forged or misrepresented, and the path to reclaiming control. The moment of empowerment didn't feel like victory. It felt like preparation, like planting seeds in soil that had been stripped bare. By the end of the week, the wheels of action were set in motion. Legal consultations, documents filed, account freezes, all steps meticulously planned and executed. I returned to my room each evening with a sense of calm purpose. My anger had been tempered into precision. My sadness had been transmuted into strategy. The same hands that had cooked meals, wiped tears, and patched scraped knees now wielded the tools of agency, authority, and reclamation. And in that space, I learned a fundamental truth. Abandonment is not the end. Neglect is not finality. What others see as weakness can, when recognized and embraced, become the foundation of strength. I had been underestimated for decades, but never again. Every whispered assumption, every silent judgment, every betrayal became fuel, not for revenge in its rawest form, but for justice, for dignity, for a life that I refused to let be stolen. I realized too that this wasn't just about me. It was about every woman who had been told she was too old, too frail, too much to carry. Every elder who had been quietly erased, marginalized, or discarded. I would not only reclaim my own life, I would reclaim a narrative that proved survival, agency, and justice are not bound by age or circumstance. I would make SCI, or that my story, my fight, my voice, would echo for those who might need it in the future. And so, with notebook in hand, my lists complete, my calls made and my plans set, I allowed myself a quiet, victorious thought. They had thought I was finished. They had thought that years of labor and love could be repaid with silence and absence. But I wasn't finished, not by a long shot. And when the time came, they would see that the quietest, gentlest hands can build the strongest walls, and the softest voice can deliver the sharpest truth. I started with small victories, almost invisible, yet monumental to me. The first was regaining control over my own finances. For years, my children had assured me they were helping manage bills, investments, and accounts, and I had trusted them blindly, thinking that love would always be the guiding hand. But trust, when unreciprocated, becomes vulnerability. I learned to read every statement, verify every transaction, and confront every inconsistency with calm, undeniable authority. Each corrected error was more than just a number. It was proof that I had never lost the ability to stand for myself. The days became a rhythm of observation and action. I learned the staff at the facility, who was kind, who was indifferent, who sought shortcuts. I made mental notes, then tangible ones, documenting routines, shifts, and irregularities. I began leaving small but deliberate reminders of my presence, a personal mug in the common room, a carefully chosen photograph on my bedside table. Nothing extravagant, nothing aggressive, just subtle statements that I existed, that I mattered, that my space could not be erased. I also discovered that isolation could be transformed into strategy. While the world outside seemed to have abandoned me, I realized the advantage of quiet. I had time to think, to plan, to reclaim, and to nurture myself in ways that decades of caregiving had not allowed. I began to read books that had been left untouched, to write letters to myself that no one else would read, to engage in exercises that strengthened not just my body, but my mind. I was rebuilding, quietly but deliberately, one piece at a time. And yet the ache of absence remained. Every door that stayed shut, every phone call unanswered, reminded me of what I had lost. I would not lie. There were nights when tears came unbidden, when the shadows seemed to whisper of betrayal, when I questioned whether all my efforts had been in vain. But I reminded myself that pain could be instructive. It sharpened my focus. It fueled my resolve. It reminded me that my story was mine to tell, not theirs to rewrite. I began to reach out beyond my immediate family, friends from decades past, neighbors who had once laughed with me over backyard fences, colleagues from long-ago jobs. They became my lifelines. Slowly, I reconnected with a world that had felt smaller than it truly was, and in those conversations, I noticed something remarkable. People wanted to help. They wanted to listen. They wanted to witness my reclaiming of agency. The isolation my children had imposed could not extend to everyone. Community, I realized, was my secret weapon. With growing confidence, I began asserting myself in small, visible ways. If a staff member overlooked my request, I repeated it politely but firmly. If my children assumed I could be persuaded into compliance, I stood my ground. Each interaction was a test, a training ground for resilience. I learned to speak not from anger, but from precision, not from fear, but from clarity. The strength of quiet authority became a shield and a sword, protecting me from further attempts at erasure. I also began documenting my story in greater detail, not just legal records, not just financial statements, but a chronicle of life itself, the sacrifices, the love, the moments of triumph and despair. I wrote late into the evenings, the pencil scratching across paper like a heartbeat reminding me that I was alive, that I mattered, that I was not a footnote in anyone's narrative. Each sentence became an affirmation. I am seen. I am heard. I am unstoppable. And as I wrote, I noticed patterns I had never seen before. My children, though capable of love, were often guided more by convenience than conscience. Their absence was not a reflection of my worth, but a mirror of their priorities. Recognizing this didn't lessen the sting, but it clarified my path. I would not plead for attention or affection. I would not beg for acknowledgement. I would assert my right to existence, to autonomy, to dignity. And in that clarity, I found a freedom I hadn't felt in decades. The legal steps progressed slowly, methodically. Each document filed, each meeting attended, each phone call placed became another brick in the wall of my reclamation. I realized that power didn't come from rage, though rage was a useful fuel. It came from preparation, from knowledge, from careful, deliberate action. The same patience I had exercised in raising children, in cooking meals, in mending scraped knees, now served me in the most important fight of my life, for myself. I also began to notice subtle changes in those around me. Staff who had been indifferent suddenly approached with caution. Friends who had assumed I was fragile now looked at me with respect. Even my children, though unaware of the full extent of my planning, began to sense a shift. Their attempts at manipulation faltered. Their assumptions no longer held sway. The quiet strength I had nurtured in isolation radiated outward, undeniable and immutable. One afternoon, as I sat in the common room with my notebook open, I noticed a younger woman watching me. She smiled, tentative but genuine. "You remind me of my grandmother," she said softly. "She never let anyone push her around, no matter what." Her words were simple, but they struck me profoundly. In that brief moment, I realized the power of example. My struggle was not just for myself, it was for everyone who would come after me, my courage, my insistence on dignity, my refusal to be invisible, these were legacies in themselves. With each passing day, the narrative of abandonment lost some of its weight. It was replaced, slowly but surely, by the narrative of empowerment. I was no longer the helpless figure my children assumed I would be. I was an active participant in my own life, a strategist, a warrior cloaked in quiet determination. And in that transformation, I felt a joy I hadn't expected, not the fleeting pleasure of recognition, but the deeper satisfaction of self-reclamation. Evenings became a time for reflection, for consolidation, for quiet triumphs. I would sit by the window watching the sun dip below the horizon and think of all the small victories of the day. A call returned, a document corrected, a staff member persuaded to follow procedure. Each success, no matter how minor, was proof that I was building a life that could not be ignored, a presence that could not be erased. And I began to plan the next steps, not out of revenge, but out of inevitability. I would ensure my home, my finances, my life were secure. I would make certain my voice could never again be silenced. I would teach those who thought abandonment was permanent that resilience is not optional, it is a birthright. The same hands that had raised a family now raised their own banner of agency and power. I realized, in quiet moments of reflection, that the story of abandonment was not just a story of loss. It was also a story of awakening. Pain had forced me to confront realities I had long ignored. Neglect had compelled me to assert boundaries I had never deemed necessary, and isolation had provided the space to discover a strength I had always possessed but never fully acknowledged. And so, as the sun set, as the shadows grew long, as the quiet of the room enveloped me, I allowed a small, satisfied smile to touch my lips. They had assumed I was finished. They had assumed silence. They had assumed compliance. But I had reclaimed my life piece by piece, word by word, step by step. And in that reclamation, I found a freedom and a dignity that no absence, no neglect, and no betrayal could ever take away. The days following my first victories in the facility were a study in patience and observation. I noticed small behaviors that revealed larger truths about people, nurses who hurried through their rounds without a thought, administrators who relied on assumptions instead of facts, visitors who glanced at me with pity rather than recognition. I catalogued everything, quietly but meticulously. I understood now that knowledge was power, and every detail I recorded could one day serve as a tool in my reclamation. I also began to notice the subtle dynamics among the residents. Some were resigned, others defiant. Some whispered about the injustices they had faced, while others sat silent, as if erasing themselves from the world would make the world leave them alone. I recognized in their stories echoes of my own experience, and it became clear that my fight was not just personal, it was symbolic. It was a reminder to anyone who had been dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated that resistance was possible and that dignity could be reclaimed. Every conversation I had, every interaction I engaged in, became a practice in control. I learned to speak with precision, never allowing anger to cloud my words, never permitting uncertainty to weaken my stance. When a staff member questioned my decisions, I answered calmly, factually, and deliberately. When a fellow resident attempted to challenge me or assert dominance, I remained composed, my presence a silent reminder that I would not be intimidated. These small exercises were part of a larger strategy, reinforcing my authority, my autonomy, and my indomitable presence. I also began to strategize outside the walls of the facility. I called my lawyer, Monica Reeves, whose voice held both surprise and admiration when I outlined the situation. She reminded me of the legal avenues available: revocation of power of attorney, verification of mental capacity, recovery of misappropriated funds, and the protection of property rights. I listened carefully, absorbing every detail. I realized that my greatest weapons were not rage or resentment, but preparation, foresight, and adherence to the law. These would be the instruments of justice in a world that had tried to erase me. Letters became my new form of communication, not to beg, not to plead, but to assert my intent. Each word was deliberate, each phrase chosen with care. I addressed my children with clarity, outlining the facts they had ignored or manipulated. I detailed the discrepancies in financial records, the unauthorized changes in my property agreements, and the false narratives they had spread to neighbors and friends. I sent these letters certified, ensuring they could not claim ignorance. Each signature, each stamp was a declaration of my competence, my awareness, and my refusal to be silenced. Simultaneously, I focused on rebuilding my own mental and physical strength. I had spent decades prioritizing everyone else, and now it was time to prioritize myself. I walked the facility halls when permitted, stretching my legs and reinforcing stamina. I read books that challenged my mind and sparked new ideas. I wrote in journals, sometimes reflecting on past pain, other times sketching visions for a future that belonged to me. I reclaimed my evenings with meditation, visualization, and exercises that reminded me of my vitality and autonomy. Social connections became a crucial part of my recovery. I began reaching out to former neighbors, friends, and community members I had drifted away from. Slowly, I rebuilt a network of support and witnesses to my life, people who would later testify to my competence and character if needed. These connections reminded me that community could be a shield, a reinforcement of dignity, and a network of accountability that extended far beyond the walls my children had tried to confine me within. Then came the subtle manipulations from my children. They would send small, seemingly harmless gifts or notes, attempting to gauge my response. I observed their intentions carefully, resisting the instinct to react emotionally. Each action they took revealed their assumptions and their expectations, that I would comply, that I would remain dependent, that I would accept their narrative. But I refused to feed their assumptions. I responded with neutrality, careful boundaries, and quiet determination. Every interaction reinforced the lesson that I would no longer be moved by fear, guilt, or manipulation. The nursing facility, which had initially felt like a prison, became a laboratory for empowerment. I studied the staff, the schedules, the routines. I made small adjustments to my own environment, placing important documents out of reach of unauthorized hands, marking key items, keeping notes on interactions and observations. Each action, no matter how minor it seemed, was part of a larger plan to reclaim control over my life. I realized that empowerment was rarely sudden. It was a series of deliberate choices, exercised consistently over time. And in the quiet moments, I allowed myself to dream. I imagined walking freely through my own home again, reclaiming the spaces that had been taken from me. I visualized boundaries that could never again be crossed, doors that opened only to my choosing, and a life in which my voice carried weight rather than being dismissed. These visualizations were not fantasies. They were rehearsals, mental blueprints for the steps I would take once the law and circumstance aligned. Through it all, I maintained my dignity. I refused to cry in public, to beg, or to allow pity to shape my identity. I observed the reactions of my children, noting the discomfort, the hesitation, the faltering of their assumptions. Without saying a word, I communicated a truth they could not ignore, that I was alive, competent, and capable of reclaiming every part of my life they had tried to control. And then, one day, a breakthrough arrived. Not a legal victory, not a confrontation, but a subtle acknowledgement from the facility staff. A nurse, who had previously dismissed me as frail, approached with a question about my plans and listened attentively as I outlined steps for my own care and organization. Her demeanor shifted from condescension to respect. That moment, small and quiet, was monumental. It confirmed that my presence, my mind, and my agency could not be ignored, not even in a place designed to diminish me. I realized that reclaiming life is not about dramatics. It is about consistent, deliberate action. It is about asserting boundaries, reinforcing autonomy, and refusing to accept narratives that diminish your worth. Every word written, every call made, every observation recorded was a stitch in the fabric of my newfound power. My children may have thought they could erase me, but they had underestimated the depth of my resilience, the precision of my planning, and the patience I had honed over decades. Then came the legal steps that would solidify my autonomy, Monica Reeves guided me through revoking the forged powers of attorney, validating my mental competence with medical documentation, and reclaiming control over finances and property. Each meeting, each form, each procedural step was executed deliberately, with no room for error. It was methodical, relentless, and above all, justified. I was not acting out of revenge. I was acting to restore the life that had been stolen from me. Meanwhile, I continued to document, to observe, and to strategize. Every interaction with my children, every maneuver they attempted, was logged meticulously. I anticipated reactions, prepared contingencies, and ensured that no move could surprise me. The quiet strength I had nurtured was now paired with tactical foresight. I had transformed from a caretaker into a strategist, from a victim into a force to be reckoned with, all without ever losing my dignity. Legal preparations intensified. Monica Reeves became a critical partner in ensuring that every step was legitimate, airtight, and strategic. Together, we reviewed the powers of attorney, assessed financial records, and verified my legal rights. The complexity was daunting at times, but I found clarity in methodical planning. Every document reviewed, every form signed, and every legal procedure followed was a step toward reclaiming the life my children had attempted to control. Law, when understood and applied carefully, became a tool of empowerment rather than a source of fear. Amid these practical actions, I maintained a focus on perception and presentation. The facility was a theater of subtle influence, and I learned to navigate it with careful choreography. How I presented myself, composed, alert, and deliberate, shaped how others perceived my capability. Staff members began to approach me with questions rather than assumptions, acknowledging my competence. Fellow residents, too, began noticing the shift, observing that the quiet woman who had once been overlooked now commanded respect through patience and insight. The emotional dimension of this journey was equally significant. I allowed myself brief moments of reflection and sadness, not indulgence, but acknowledgement. The pain of abandonment, the sting of betrayal, and the sense of isolation were real, yet I refused to let them define me. Instead, I transformed these emotions into fuel for strategy, clarity, and action. Emotional intelligence, I realized, was a silent weapon. Understanding my own responses and predicting those of others allowed me to maneuver with precision and patience. An important breakthrough came when I regained control over certain aspects of my personal life. Decisions about my schedule, medical consultations, and communications were no longer dictated by my children. Each small decision reinforced autonomy, gradually eroding the subtle control they thought they held. The sense of self-determination, once lost, returned incrementally but unmistakably. I began to feel the tangible shift. The power to shape my own life, however contained, was now firmly in my hands. I also revisited memories of my life before betrayal, moments of joy, love, and independence. These reflections were not indulgent nostalgia, but reminders of what I had fought for and deserved. They strengthened my resolve and provided mental clarity. I realized that reclaiming my life was not just about undoing the wrongs inflicted by my children. It was about restoring the richness, dignity, and agency that had been taken from me. Memory, after all, is not just past. It is a foundation upon which the present can be rebuilt. Another crucial aspect of my strategy was understanding my children's psychology. I observed their habits, predicted their reactions, and anticipated their defenses. Their arrogance, their assumption that I would acquiesce, became tools for my planning. By remaining calm, observant, and deliberate, I turned their expectations against them, creating situations where the truth could no longer be ignored and their manipulations were rendered ineffective. Insight, combined with patience, became a formidable instrument of reclamation. Socially, I nurtured connections with allies outside the facility, friends, former colleagues, and community members who knew me well. They became witnesses, sounding boards, and sources of moral support. Each interaction reinforced that I was not alone and that the isolation my children had attempted to enforce was artificial. These connections reminded me that the world beyond the walls was full of witnesses, allies, and validation, all of which would reinforce my credibility when the confrontation came. I also explored creative outlets. Writing, sketching, and journaling became more than activities. They were tools for mental clarity and strategic documentation. Every thought, every observation, every plan was recorded with precision. Not only did this create a personal record, but it also trained my mind to think analytically, to notice patterns, and to plan with foresight. Creativity, I discovered, was a subtle yet potent weapon in reclaiming agency. It allowed me to see possibilities beyond the immediate confines of the facility. The realization grew that this struggle was as much symbolic as it was practical. It was a testament to endurance, dignity, and the power of deliberate action. By refusing to yield, by reclaiming autonomy and asserting competence, I was not merely restoring my life. I was redefining the narrative of aging, family, and respect. I was demonstrating that no one has the right to erase another person's existence, and that patience, intelligence, and self-respect can overturn even the most entrenched assumptions. And then came the moment that crystallized everything. The recognition from those around me, staff members, fellow residents, and external allies began to treat me as a capable, autonomous adult rather than a passive ward. This shift, though subtle, was profound. Respect, once denied, could not be revoked. Authority, quietly asserted over months of careful action, was now acknowledged without question. The slow accumulation of evidence, patience, and deliberate choices had created an irreversible reality. I was no longer subject to manipulation, neglect, or control. In that realization, I understood a deeper truth. Life is rarely about sudden victories. It is about consistent, deliberate, and patient action. Autonomy is earned through strategy, dignity, and persistence. Respect is commanded not by anger, but by unyielding presence. And though the betrayal I experienced was profound, the reclamation of my life became a narrative not of vengeance but of mastery, a testament to what can be achieved when one refuses to be silenced, ignored, or dismissed. Once the foundations of my independence were secured, I turned my attention to the next layer, reclaiming the spaces my children had tried to occupy in my life. It wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about restoring boundaries and rebuilding a world where I could thrive without intrusion or interference. Every phone call, every unexpected visit, and every assumption made on my behalf became an opportunity to assert clarity. I no longer responded out of anger or fear. I responded deliberately, with precision, with the unmistakable weight of someone who knew their own value. Jason's attempts at communication became predictable. He would call, usually during inconvenient times, leaving voicemails that were part apology, part entitlement. I listened to each one, then documented them, creating a timeline that showed the pattern of his manipulation. This process was almost meditative. It allowed me to observe, analyze, and detach. Anger no longer dictated my actions. Observation did. Each call, each message, each hesitation on his part was a piece of evidence, a lesson in strategy, and a reminder of why I had to maintain patience. Meanwhile, Tyler blossomed under my care. His presence reminded me why this battle was worth every moment. He laughed more freely, asked questions about the past, and showed curiosity for the life that had been withheld from him. I realized that the stakes were no longer just my dignity. They were the legacy I would pass down. Actions taken in haste could undo years of effort, but measured decisions, guided by principle and foresight, could create a future where he felt secure, valued, and empowered. I also recognized the importance of rituals in reclaiming my sense of place. Simple acts, preparing breakfast at my own pace, choosing my wardrobe without consultation, tending to my garden, became affirmations of autonomy. Each morning, as I sipped tea on the porch, I reminded myself that this space was mine, that the air around me carried no obligations to justify myself to anyone. The quiet moments were more powerful than confrontations. They were tangible proof that I could exist fully, without fear, without apology, without compromise. At the facility, my interactions with staff became more collaborative. I no longer asked for permission, I offered insight, guidance, and solutions. My medical appointments were scheduled with clarity, my preferences were documented formally, and my requests were met with acknowledgement rather than assumption. Staff members, initially indifferent or skeptical, now treated me as an integral part of my own care. I realized then that reclaiming control often required teaching others how to respect it, and doing so with calm authority rather than anger ensured compliance without conflict. Parallel to these victories, I began planning for the ultimate reclamation, the property that had been taken from me. Every document I needed, every legal procedure, every financial decision was reviewed with meticulous care. Monica Reeves guided me through each step, ensuring that when the confrontation came, it would be undeniable, irrefutable, and complete. Strategy, I had learned, was not only about law but about timing, optics, and precision. The house, once a site of betrayal, would become a symbol of restored agency, a reminder that the life one builds with sacrifice is not so easily erased. I also found strength in the small, overlooked relationships around me. Friends, neighbors, and former colleagues became allies, sources of encouragement, and quiet witnesses to my journey. Each acknowledgement of my competence, each moment of solidarity, reinforced my resolve. I realized that reclaiming one's life is not always a solitary act. It is reinforced by community, by recognition, and by the subtle support of those who see the truth when others choose to ignore it. Tyler and I created routines that strengthened our bond and further isolated us from the manipulation of his father. Cooking together, planting in the garden, and sharing stories of our pasts became rituals of healing. He was learning to recognize honesty, integrity, and patience in action, lessons that his father had failed to teach. Every skill, every memory, every moment of laughter was a brick in the foundation of a life he could call his own, separate from betrayal, free from manipulation, and rooted in love and security. As the weeks passed, I noticed subtle changes in Jason's behavior. His visits grew less frequent. His tone on the phone became more tentative. He no longer assumed entitlement over my decisions, and when he tried to assert influence, it was met with calm, deliberate resistance. The power dynamics had shifted, and he was beginning to recognize it. But rather than relishing this, I maintained distance. The lesson I wanted him to internalize was not about fear or humiliation, it was about accountability. True awareness comes not from loud confrontation, but from the quiet realization of what one has lost. During this period, I also focused on my own mental clarity and creativity. Writing, painting, and journaling became outlets for expression and planning. Each entry in my notebook served as both reflection and strategy, blending emotional insight with practical action. I discovered that creativity was not merely an indulgence, it was a form of empowerment. Through these acts, I reclaimed not only my physical space, but also my internal world, a sanctuary where I could process, plan, and act without interference or oversight. Community engagement also played a critical role in my journey. I began contributing to local initiatives for elder advocacy, sharing my story discreetly to raise awareness of manipulative tactics, legal rights, and personal agency. By helping others, I reinforced my own sense of purpose and legitimacy. The narrative of betrayal no longer defined me. It became a platform for empowerment, a tool for social impact, and a means to demonstrate that resilience is more than personal, it is communal. Financial autonomy was another critical pillar. Every account, every asset, every piece of documentation was reviewed to ensure that control remained unequivocally mine. Monica Reeves assisted with audits, reconciliations, and formal verifications, ensuring that no legal loophole could be exploited. This attention to detail was exhausting at times, but it reinforced the principle that autonomy must be defended actively. Wealth, while not the primary goal, became a tool for independence, a tangible representation of the agency my children had attempted to erase. As these months passed, I realized the subtle power of observation, watching without reacting, noting patterns without interruption, and responding deliberately when necessary, created an environment where my presence was felt without confrontation. I became the quiet center around which the dynamics of control shifted. Each carefully measured action, each deliberate choice reinforced the reality that I was no longer a passive participant. The very act of observing, documenting, and existing with clarity became a form of authority. At the same time, I nurtured my sense of identity beyond the roles imposed by family. I remembered my past accomplishments, my personal victories, and the life I had led before betrayal. This self-recognition was critical. It reminded me that my worth was intrinsic, independent of my children's approval or acknowledgement. Autonomy, dignity, and self-respect are not granted. They are reclaimed through recognition of one's own value. And through it all, I held the quiet hope that Tyler would carry the lessons of integrity, patience, and agency into his own life. He was a living testament to resilience, a reminder that while betrayal can wound, it cannot erase the essence of character nurtured with love and intentionality. My work was as much about restoring my life as it was about ensuring that the next generation understood the importance of self-respect, boundaries, and deliberate action. By the time the house next door had been secured and Tyler's life stabilized, the real shift had taken hold, not in the physical spaces I inhabited, but in the mental and emotional landscape I now ruled. It wasn't revenge for its own sake anymore. It was justice lived in quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't need applause or acknowledgement. The lessons were subtle but profound. Power isn't always loud, and triumph isn't always immediate. Sometimes it's measured in the persistence of your own presence and the undeniable clarity of your intentions. Jason's behavior continued to reflect the slow unraveling of his assumptions. He had believed that dismissing me, erasing me, and controlling my environment would leave me powerless. What he hadn't accounted for was that patience, strategy, and deliberate action carry a force far heavier than impulsive anger. I had learned that when someone underestimates the depth of a person's resilience, they leave themselves vulnerable to consequences they cannot predict. My calm, measured reclaiming of my life became the most powerful statement I could make. Every interaction with him or Danielle was now guided by boundaries. When calls came, I answered with economy, clear, deliberate, and devoid of unnecessary explanation. Texts and messages were replied to only when necessary and always with precision. The goal wasn't to punish but to establish unmistakable limits. They needed to understand that their assumptions and manipulations could no longer penetrate my life. Authority, I realized, is most potent when exercised quietly and consistently. At the same time, Tyler thrived under the routines we established. He was more confident, more curious, and more at peace. We cultivated traditions that weren't dictated by the past, but built consciously in the present. Morning garden walks, shared breakfasts, evening storytelling sessions. These moments, ordinary in appearance, became extraordinary in their impact. They restored a rhythm of trust, love, and security that had been disrupted by betrayal. Every seed planted, every meal shared, every story told was a reinforcement of continuity and care, a shield against manipulation. One afternoon, while Tyler and I were pruning the roses along the fence, he asked, "Grandma, do you think Dad even understands what he did?" I paused, shears in hand, sunlight warming my face. I looked at him, at the careful rows of red blooms, and said, "He understands consequences now in his own way, but understanding doesn't mean forgiveness, and it doesn't mean he gets to erase the past. That part belongs to us." He nodded, and I could see the lesson settling in. The past cannot be changed, but how you choose to inhabit the present is your own domain. The house next door, once a symbol of intrusion, gradually became a testament to restraint and observation. I watched, documented, and let the subtle realities unfold naturally. Lights that flickered too late, doors left open, moments of tension in their voices. Each observation reinforced the lesson that actions have consequences. Yet I did not gloat. There was no satisfaction in humiliation. The satisfaction lay in restoring equilibrium, in witnessing fairness quietly assert itself. At the facility, the staff began to acknowledge my strategic approach, my detailed notes, clarity in communication, and precise documentation created a framework others followed without resistance. They no longer treated me as someone to manage, but as someone to consult. This shift, subtle at first, became evident in every interaction. Authority, it seemed, could be reclaimed without aggression, simply through presence, preparation, and consistency. I also began mentoring other women in similar situations, discreetly and intentionally. Sharing my experiences with those who had been marginalized or dismissed offered a sense of community and reinforced the importance of agency. The stories were difficult to hear, women betrayed by children, neighbors, institutions, but sharing and strategizing together created empowerment. It became clear to me that resilience is magnified when paired with connection. By helping others reclaim their autonomy, I also reinforced my own. Financial control continued to be a pillar of my independence. Every transaction, every account statement, every legal document was reviewed regularly. I ensured that no surprises could destabilize the progress I had made. Monica Reeves' guidance was invaluable, but it was my attention to detail that made the difference. Each step, each verification, each calculated move reinforced the principle that autonomy requires vigilance. Independence is not passive, it is active, deliberate, and sustained. At home, I nurtured creativity as a form of resilience. Painting, writing, and journaling were not just hobbies, they were tools for reflection, strategy, and personal empowerment. Each stroke of paint and every carefully chosen word became a reaffirmation of my agency. Through these acts, I found clarity, perspective, and strength. The creative process became a mirror for life, deliberate, thoughtful, and persistent. It was a reminder that power doesn't always announce itself loudly. It manifests in quiet mastery of your own world. Tyler's understanding of consequence and autonomy grew alongside his emotional intelligence. He saw firsthand that honesty, patience, and measured action matter more than immediate satisfaction or impulsive reaction. I watched him apply these lessons in school, with friends, and in his own interactions at home. The distance from his father's control allowed him to experiment, fail, and succeed safely, learning lessons he otherwise might never have internalized. The legacy I was passing on was not only legal or financial, it was moral, emotional, and strategic. Meanwhile, Jason's occasional attempts at contact were met with composure. He approached with tentative questions, seeking information or reconciliation, but I answered only to clarify boundaries. He began to realize that the life he assumed control over was no longer accessible to him. I did not need to enforce fear. The awareness of what he had lost was already restructuring his behavior. Authority and respect, I had discovered, are cultivated through consistency and presence rather than confrontation. At the same time, my involvement in the community deepened. I contributed to senior advocacy programs, shared experiences with legal rights, and engaged in initiatives supporting older women at risk of exploitation. These efforts were more than altruistic. They reinforced my sense of purpose, grounded my agency, and created tangible impact. Each success, each story shared, each life supported amplified the significance of my own journey. Reclaiming independence became not only personal but also collective. As the weeks turned into months, the quiet power of observation became a central theme. I no longer had to react in anger or assert control loudly. The environment adjusted itself. Neighbors, staff, and even Tyler internalized the rhythms I had established. The lesson for Jason was embedded not in confrontation, but in the evidence of a life reclaimed and maintained with deliberate care. Silence, I realized, carries its own authority. It signals confidence, stability, and invulnerability in ways words cannot match. Ultimately, what emerged from this period was a new normal, a life defined not by betrayal, fear, or manipulation, but by deliberate agency, strategic planning, and measured action. I had transformed spaces of oppression into platforms of empowerment. Tyler thrived, my community engagement expanded, and every aspect of my life reflected the clarity and strength I had cultivated. The past, while painful, became a resource, a guide for action, a source of insight, and a reminder of what resilience looks like in practice. The quiet rhythm of our life settled into something rare and steady. Morning sunlight spilled across the kitchen, illuminating Tyler's small hands as he stirred batter for pancakes, humming a tune I didn't recognize but liked immediately. I watched him and felt the weight of history, the sacrifices, the betrayals, the nights spent questioning whether the world could still hold kindness. And yet here he was, thriving, a living testament to persistence and care. Every day he reminded me why reclaiming my life wasn't just about vengeance, it was about legacy. Jason's presence, or rather his absence, was a constant shadow. He was nearby, living in the house he thought he had taken from me, yet his existence was muted, ineffective. Danielle's occasional flares of noise and frustration were only signals of desperation, not power. They had assumed that their intimidation tactics, their manipulations, and their legal shortcuts would leave me powerless, and the reality was a quiet humiliation they couldn't rectify. I had turned what could have been a cage into an observatory, watching the consequences of greed and carelessness unfold without interference. Tyler was the anchor. He thrived not because I imposed control, but because I offered structure and security. He came to understand boundaries, the necessity of patience, and the quiet strength in asserting oneself without aggression. I watched him replicate these behaviors in school, in friendships, and in moments when he had to make decisions that tested his judgment. The lesson he absorbed was clear. True power is patient, principled, and deliberate. It is rooted not in domination but in thoughtful action. Each day, the garden became a living metaphor. We pruned, planted, and watered with intent, knowing that growth comes from care, consistency, and attention. The roses along the fence bloomed as if in celebration of autonomy regained, their vivid red petals a constant reminder that beauty thrives when nurtured, not forced. Tyler often paused to inspect the blooms, marveling at the transformation from tiny buds to resilient flowers. He would run his fingers along the thorned stems and smile, as if understanding that resilience and protection are intertwined. Meanwhile, I continued the legal and financial oversight that had secured my independence. Every account, every property document, and every transaction was monitored. I maintained a rhythm of accountability and vigilance that Jason could never anticipate. He had assumed that neglect or age would render me powerless, but I had discovered that foresight, preparation, and meticulous attention to detail are more formidable than physical strength or youthful audacity. Each verification, each cross-checked statement reinforced my autonomy and reminded me that control, once lost, can always be reclaimed with precision. Community engagement expanded. I began hosting small gatherings for neighbors and friends, not as displays of superiority, but as exercises in empowerment. I spoke to women who felt invisible, unheard, or undervalued. My story became a template. Reclaim your rights, assert your boundaries, and do not allow the assumptions of others to dictate your worth. The reactions were profound. Tears, nods, whispered affirmations, and I realized that empowerment is contagious. The energy I cultivated within my home rippled outward, transforming not just my own life but the lives of others. At the same time, I devoted time to personal development. Painting became more than a hobby. It was a tool for reflection, strategy, and emotional clarity. I painted every morning, often capturing the sunlight on the garden, the subtle curves of the house, or the quiet resilience in Tyler's posture. These canvases were meditative exercises, allowing me to process the past while visualizing the future. Each stroke of color, each careful application of shade and light, reinforced the principle that agency is built deliberately, one careful step at a time. Jason's intermittent attempts at interaction became exercises in boundary setting. When he appeared at the fence or called unexpectedly, I responded with measured calm. I did not scold, guilt, or retaliate verbally. My answers were concise, factual, and deliberate. Silence became my ally, demonstrating control without aggression. Over time, he learned the unspoken lesson. Manipulation and intimidation would not provoke action or fear. Power, in its most effective form, is quiet, consistent, and unmistakable. I began documenting our progress with Tyler, not out of obsession, but as a way to observe patterns and celebrate milestones. His growth in confidence, emotional intelligence, and practical skills was evident in small ways. He completed homework without prompting, offered thoughtful insights during conversations, and engaged in friendships with empathy and care. He had learned the difference between power wielded for selfish gain and authority exercised responsibly. My influence, subtle yet persistent, became part of his foundation. Evenings became a time for reflection and storytelling. We shared memories, recounted lessons, and laughed over stories of misadventures. Tyler's questions were insightful and honest, sometimes cutting deeper than he realized. "Grandma, do you think Dad ever felt guilty? Or, do you regret leaving the house?" I answered with honesty tempered by wisdom. Guilt is private, regret is optional, and boundaries are necessary for survival. These conversations became a training ground for understanding the nuances of human behavior, the complexity of morality, and the power of deliberate choice. I also began revisiting the legal aspects of the estate. Each document, each clause, and each contingency was reviewed meticulously. I wanted to ensure that Tyler's future remained secure, that my contributions to the community were protected, and that Jason and Danielle could no longer interfere. These measures were not born of malice. They were acts of protection, strategy, and foresight. Independence is fragile until it is codified, and I refuse to leave it vulnerable. Tyler's growing comprehension of justice and consequence mirrored my own philosophy. He understood that the universe has a way of balancing actions, that choices carry weight, and that accountability is not optional. He observed how Danielle's impatience, Jason's negligence, and their assumptions about my vulnerability created ripples that could not be ignored. Watching him internalize these lessons, I felt a sense of continuity. My efforts were not only about reclaiming what was taken from me, but also about instilling principles that would guide the next generation. Even the physical space of the house became a lesson in agency. Every object placed, every room organized, every piece of furniture arranged intentionally reinforced the structure of deliberate living. Tyler participated, learning that environment shapes behavior and that care in small details translates into broader control over life. Together, we cultivated a space that reflected independence, respect, and resilience. Each corner, each surface, each carefully chosen decoration became a statement of autonomy. Meanwhile, community recognition grew. Local women began reaching out for guidance, neighbors expressed admiration, and Tyler's school noticed the difference in his demeanor. I realized that true influence is rarely flashy or performative. It is observed, internalized, and reflected back through the actions of others. My life, once disrupted by betrayal, had become a model of measured authority, strategic empowerment, and quiet confidence. Even in moments of solitude, the lessons persisted. I would sit in my favorite chair by the window, observing the world outside, reflecting on how far we had come. The hum of activity in the neighborhood, the occasional glimpse of Jason pacing or Danielle struggling with their frustration, served as reminders of the consequences of arrogance, neglect, and assumption. My power was not in retaliation, it was in endurance, clarity, and deliberate action. And so, as the seasons changed, the house flourished, Tyler thrived, and I lived with purpose. Each day reinforced the principle that agency is not given, it is reclaimed. Each interaction, each boundary enforced, each lesson taught contributed to a life defined not by the betrayals of the past, but by the deliberate mastery of the present. Independence is a practice, resilience a discipline, and true power a quiet, unshakable certainty. Winter came slowly, stretching its grey fingers across the neighbourhood, and yet within our home, warmth thrived. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon, baked apples, and the faint tang of fresh bread. Tyler, now more confident than ever, had begun experimenting with recipes, combining flavors with a sense of intuition that made me proud. It wasn't just the cooking, it was the patience, the care, the meticulous attention to detail. He was learning to nurture, and in doing so, he reflected the values I had always hoped to instill. Watching him, I realized the stakes of every choice I had made. Independence wasn't simply about survival. It was about shaping a life that could stand firm under pressure, that could respond with integrity, and that could grow despite adversity. The house across the street had become an empty theatre for the echoes of consequence. Jason and Danielle's departures left a vacuum that was almost tangible, a silent testament to the weight of actions poorly considered. Tyler and I often observed from our porch the stillness of their lawn, the lack of care in their property, the scattered remnants of items left behind in haste. These visual cues were more powerful than any confrontation, louder than any argument. They were a reminder that the world does not overlook negligence or arrogance, and that those who assume entitlement without accountability eventually face their own reckoning. I continued cultivating my network. Calls, letters, and quiet visits to friends who had once been close but distant during my struggles became regular. I shared my experiences and, more importantly, my strategies for reclaiming control. Many of these women had endured similar betrayals, abandoned by children, dismissed by spouses, or underestimated by society. Each conversation reinforced a larger truth. Resilience is amplified when shared, and empowerment becomes contagious when it's modeled rather than preached. My story became a blueprint, showing that age, experience, and deliberate planning could overturn assumptions of weakness. Tyler's curiosity expanded beyond the home. He began asking questions about finances, legal rights, and the importance of documentation. I guided him patiently, showing the significance of understanding contracts, powers of attorney, and estate planning. He listened with a seriousness that sometimes startled me, his young mind absorbing the weight of responsibility and foresight. "Grandma," he said one evening, "I don't want to ever be like Dad." I nodded, understanding the gravity beneath his words. It wasn't just about revenge or control, it was about shaping moral clarity, ensuring the next generation could navigate life with wisdom, foresight, and courage. The legal aftermath of the house sale and estate planning had settled, leaving a framework that could not easily be challenged. Jason had attempted to inquire, but the law, combined with precise planning and documentation, rendered his curiosity powerless. This stability allowed me to focus on the softer victories. Trust restored with Tyler, relationships rebuilt in the community, and the personal satisfaction of reclaiming my narrative. Control is intoxicating when it is exercised justly and thoughtfully, and I relished the quiet triumph of having finally secured the life I deserved. Art remained a central focus. The canvases multiplied, filling corners of the house with bursts of color, emotion, and reflection. Some were abstract, expressing feelings that words could not capture, while others depicted moments of clarity: the garden in spring, the sunlight on Tyler's hands, the front porch as I watched the world pass. Painting became a dialogue with myself, a meditation on what had been lost and what had been regained. Each brushstroke was deliberate, a reinforcement of agency and control, a declaration that the life I lived was mine in every sense. Tyler, too, had begun exploring art. I guided him without overstepping, allowing him freedom to express himself while subtly imparting lessons in patience, detail, and persistence. Our evenings often included quiet discussions about color theory, composition, and symbolism. These lessons were more than artistic, they were moral. Each piece reflected intention, care, and responsibility, mirroring the principles that underpinned every decision I had made since reclaiming my independence. As winter deepened, the contrast between my home and the house across the street grew sharper. Our life radiated stability, warmth, and purpose, while theirs remained static, empty, and hollow. Danielle's occasional presence was marked by tension, awkwardness, and visible frustration. Jason, once arrogant and dismissive, had become a figure of muted consequence, his presence diminished by the very choices he had made. The neighborhood noticed. Whispers circulated, subtle acknowledgement of a power shift that needed no announcement. Quiet authority, exercised with precision and principle, always speaks louder than noise. The garden flourished despite the chill. I had planted winter vegetables alongside the roses, a testament to resilience and foresight. Tyler delighted in watching the sprouts emerge, understanding that growth requires patience, nurturing, and the right conditions. Gardening became a shared language, teaching lessons in preparation, observation, and care. Each bloom, each sprout, was a reminder that life continues to expand when tended with diligence and intention. Tyler's schoolwork also benefited from the stability and guidance he received at home. He completed assignments with diligence, engaged in group projects thoughtfully, and gradually became more assertive in discussions without aggression. These small successes were more significant than any legal victory or financial maneuver. They were evidence that care, guidance, and consistent boundaries can shape character, influence behavior, and instill values that endure beyond temporary victories. The lessons for Jason and Danielle were ongoing, even without direct confrontation. Their misjudgment, impatience, and lack of foresight continued to manifest in subtle ways. Their property showed neglect, their social interactions hinted at unresolved tension, and their attempts to regain status or control fell flat. Meanwhile, Tyler and I thrived in the quiet discipline of routine, purpose, and principle. Observing the contrast reinforced the truth I had lived, that patience, preparation, and deliberate action outweigh impulsive aggression and short-sighted decisions. In the evenings, the porch became a sanctuary. Tyler and I would sit, sipping tea, sharing thoughts, and observing the neighborhood. The act of sitting, observing, and reflecting became a ritual, reinforcing the lessons of history, consequence, and empowerment. Tyler asked questions, sometimes curious, sometimes analytical, sometimes emotional. Each response was deliberate, measured, and instructive, fostering his understanding of ethics, accountability, and personal strength. Community engagement expanded further. I began organizing workshops, not for spectacle but to share knowledge. Elder women, often underestimated, came to learn practical steps for safeguarding autonomy, finances, and well-being. Tyler accompanied me occasionally, helping to organize materials, demonstrating that responsibility begins with participation, observation, and practice. These gatherings were small yet profound, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond our immediate circle. Art, gardening, education, and mentorship became intertwined. The house itself was transformed into a hub of deliberate living. Each object, each corner, each routine reinforced principles of autonomy, care, and consequence. Tyler absorbed this daily. He watched my interactions with the community, my discipline with finances, and my consistent enforcement of boundaries with Jason and Danielle. These lessons were more enduring than any lecture or admonition. They were lived experience. Evenings often concluded with reflection. Tyler and I would discuss the day, the lessons learned, and plans for the future. I shared stories from my past, emphasizing the importance of resilience, strategic thinking, and ethical decision-making. Tyler listened intently, absorbing the weight of history and the value of foresight. His growth was a tangible representation of what deliberate, principled guidance could achieve. I occasionally reflected on Jason and Danielle, not with rage, but with quiet acknowledgement of consequence. Their choices, their impatience, and their attempts at manipulation had shaped their own outcomes. Observing from a distance, I realized that justice need not be loud, that consequences are often more powerful when indirect, and that the world has a way of balancing actions when patience and principle are exercised. The intersection of family, community, and personal agency became clear. Tyler thrived under guidance, the community benefited from shared knowledge, and I maintained autonomy with deliberate attention to detail. My past struggles, betrayals, and manipulations had transformed into a framework for enduring empowerment. Every decision, every boundary, every lesson reinforced the principle that autonomy is reclaimed through action, patience, and intentionality. Even the simplest moments, sipping tea, observing the sunrise, hearing Tyler laugh at a minor joke, were imbued with significance. They represented freedom regained, lessons absorbed, and the triumph of deliberate living over chaos and betrayal. The house, the garden, and our routines became symbols of resilience, autonomy, and the enduring value of foresight. Spring arrived softly, melting the last traces of winter snow, and with it a quiet renewal settled over our home. The garden, once dormant, erupted with life, vivid colors, fresh scents, and the hum of bees returning to pollinate. Tyler and I walked the rows together, hands brushing over new shoots, marveling at the simple miracle of growth. There was a profound lesson in it. Patience pays off, nurturing yields reward, and what is cared for deliberately will thrive. I saw in the garden a mirror of our lives, a reflection of lessons learned, boundaries enforced, and growth achieved despite adversity. The community had begun noticing more than just the physical transformations. My workshops had inspired others to act, to claim autonomy, and to reclaim their narratives. Conversations in the neighborhood shifted subtly. Where once whispers might have focused on scandal or misfortune, now they centered on example, resilience, and practical wisdom. Tyler, curious as ever, absorbed these changes with a mixture of pride and thoughtful observation. He asked questions about human behavior, morality, and consequence, and I answered candidly, sharing experiences and insights with careful guidance. Jason and Danielle remained peripheral figures, symbols of what happens when foresight, patience, and moral clarity are absent. Their sporadic appearances were marked by awkwardness, discomfort, and a subtle acknowledgement of the imbalance that had been established. I observed them not out of spite, but with quiet recognition that life often enforces justice without loud proclamations. The absence of confrontation made the lessons all the more clear, demonstrating that consequences often arrive naturally, shaped by choices rather than threats. Tyler's confidence and skill continued to grow. He managed responsibilities at home, contributed thoughtfully to discussions, and displayed a sense of initiative that filled me with quiet pride. More than any tangible accomplishment, he had internalized lessons of accountability, patience, and moral clarity. In watching him, I realized that my legacy would not be defined by property, wealth, or legal maneuvering, but by the values instilled and the character nurtured. This understanding brought a calm satisfaction, a recognition that the real victory had always been in shaping a life capable of strength, discernment, and resilience. Evenings remained our sanctuary. Sitting on the porch, we shared reflections on the day, discussed future plans, and observed the subtle rhythms of the neighborhood. The act of pausing, of witnessing life unfold with awareness, reinforced the lesson that empowerment is not always loud or immediate. It is deliberate, persistent, and built over time. Tyler's laughter, the scent of the garden, and the sense of home woven through each detail served as quiet affirmations of the journey we had undertaken together. I often thought about my younger years, about the sacrifices made and the trust extended that had gone unreturned. Those memories no longer carried bitterness. They carried wisdom, lessons refined by experience, and the quiet satisfaction of having acted with intention. The empty house across the street, the absent children, and the lingering echoes of past neglect had all become reminders not of loss, but of clarity. The life we shape is defined not by others' failures, but by the consistency and integrity of our own choices. As the sun set, casting golden light across the porch and garden, I felt a sense of completion, not in finality, but in fulfillment. Tyler and I had built more than a home. We had built a sanctuary of principle, care, and intentional living. The future remained open, but grounded in a foundation that could not be shaken by impatience, arrogance, or neglect. In nurturing the next generation, reclaiming autonomy, and witnessing the quiet consequences of others' choices, I realized that life had delivered a truth I had always known, but only now fully appreciated. Resilience, patience, and integrity endure long after absence and betrayal fade into memory.